Welcome, folks. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. We are still letting a bunch more folks in from the waiting room, so thank you for being here, and we'll kick off in just a moment. Thanks for bearing with us, folks. We're going to get started here in just a second. It looks like our waiting room is almost cleared out. Just one more minute. Okay, in the interest of time, we are wonderful behind the scenes folks. We'll keep letting people in as they trickle in, but Zai, I think we should go ahead and get started. So welcome, folks. We are so happy to be hosting this ABCT ASDD SIG discussion series today, titled Current Issues and Controversies in Autism Research, Neurodiversity and NDBIs. Please note this meeting is being recorded. We will be sharing this with folks that have requested that we're unable to make it live. So just know that you're in the room. We will be recording today. Next slide, please. So this effort was a real team collaborative effort to plan this event. We're very grateful for our ABCT membership committee, all of whom are listed there, myself included. I'm Elisabeth Sheridan, and I'm coordinating today on behalf of our membership committee. We also want to acknowledge the great leadership and support of our ASD SIG co-chairs, Drs. Higgs and Morton and Police. Last but not least, our wonderful tech committee that has provided us the Zoom platform and helped us get today ready tech-wise. And just a quick plug before we kick off our discussion today. If you aren't a member, we see lots of familiar names and faces in the room with us that are already members of our SIG. If you are not a member and you're interested in joining, there is the link that you can, the abctautism.com page outlines many wonderful features of our SIG, including the link to join and become a member. You'll also see a snapshot of the flyer that members received, or the newsletter rather, our members received on Thursday, talking about all the exciting updates, including the pre-conference that will happen this fall, in addition to the annual convention in Seattle, job postings, and many more things. So if you're interested and you don't already know about that site, please check it out. Next slide. So just a very quick housekeeping. In a moment, I'll introduce our panelists and we'll get going. I already mentioned we're recording. We do ask that folks stay on mute. Given the size of this room, we had almost 200 people registered. So I think the room may even grow as we go. We do want this to be interactive, but we ask that you stay on mute and instead use the chat function. You can chat questions directly to me, Elisabeth Sheridan, in the chat. That's the easiest way, because when we get to the Q&A, we will be using the Q&A function is how I will ask Sai the questions you're interested in. Okay, next slide. Just a very quick note about language. Many of you are already familiar with some of these resources and papers that we list here, but we are honoring both identity first and person first language. We know that majority of autistic adults do prefer being called autistic rather than a person with autism, but you'll hear our panelists use those interchangeably, and we're just very conscious and aware of the impact of language that we use. We reference a paper there about avoiding ableist language. Our wonderful co-leader, Dr. Morton, did a whole discussion series on language earlier this year. So just please keep that in mind as we go through. And without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our panelists. So our moderator today for the discussion will be Dr. Zack Nadler from Children's Mercy and University of Missouri, Kansas. He does not have any disclosures for this talk. And Dr. Rachel Schuck and Zack Williams will be our discussants today. Their disclosures are that they are a panel, or they are authors of the paper that we'll be discussing. So please just be aware of that. And without further ado, I will kick it over to Dr. Nadler to get us going.
Thank you, Dr. Sheridan, and many thanks to everyone who's contributed to making this event happen, and to the great group that we see accumulating in the room. We do value your attendance, and anyone watching this in recorded format later, we appreciate that as well. So my goal is to listen as much as possible to our guests, Dr. Schuck and Zack Williams, who we invited because of a paper I read late last year that, I don't know, I just kept thinking about. And it was one of those papers that was full of ideas I wanted to explore. And I felt like the best way to do that was to go to the source and to do it in a way that we could really hopefully spur some dialogue too. So I'm going to first turn it over to them to provide a high-level overview of that paper. And then we'll spend some time where I'm going to engage them on some of those points and questions. And then we'll end with getting to your questions. And as you will see in the chat, you can send your questions to Elisabeth Sheridan, who is listed there, and we'll make sure to get to as many as we can. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters.
All right, next slide, please. So, hi everyone, my name is Zack Williams, and I am an autistic self-advocate and a MD PhD student at Vanderbilt University. And here I am going to just give you a little bit of an overview about what we're talking about here today. And so this is all about behavioral interventions. And so this kind of falls under the broad umbrella of ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. And so ABA as a field is actually is a science. It's part of psychology. Applied behavior analysis is really the broad science of behavior change. So this is sort of talking about it like a field of clinical psychology. But we also talk about ABA as an intervention. That really thinks about ABA, usually as a shorthand for one type of intervention that is like a group of interventions. But the thing that people usually mean when they say ABA is this thing we call discrete trial teaching or discrete trial training, that is a specific kind of ABA-based intervention. But really ABA, as broadly spoken, is a family of interventions that enacts behavior change through shaping of behavior, like by reward and punishment. And ABA-based interventions are really common. They're used as kind of the first line types of behavioral interventions early in life, really as soon as an autistic autistic person gets a diagnosis, they are put into ABA oftentimes, and these continue oftentimes throughout the entirety of childhood, adolescence, into adulthood sometimes. And the research on ABA is oftentimes positive for many developmental outcomes, though there are definitely some papers showing that these research findings are somewhat mixed in terms of how strong the evidence is. When you get to actual randomized controlled trials, the findings can be much smaller in terms of effect than they have been in the past, especially in terms of some of these really, really big seminal findings from the 80s and 90s, showing that many autistic children show like much stronger IQ gains than people thought, and they were in typical treatment, et cetera. We also don't have a ton of good longitudinal studies for ABA-based interventions showing what the long-term effects are. Next slide, please. So, and there are actually a lot of concerns from the autistic community about ABA-based interventions. And one of these main things is with the goals of ABA-based interventions. So one particular concern that the autistic community has with these types of interventions is that the goals of intervention often are to sort of suppress the autistic behaviors that one can see. Behaviorism as a concept typically only focuses on observed behaviors. And so if you look at an autistic person as a set of observed autistic behaviors and say, I want to reduce those, then you are going to be saying, I just want to make this person less autistic and more neurotypical. So if that's really the goal, to just take the autistic person and make them less autistic, that may not actually be a very good goal. That may not be something that at all improves that person's quality of life. And it may just promote the masking of those autistic traits. We don't have a lot of good evidence that this is necessarily what's happening, but theoretically, this could definitely be what's happening. And so this is something the community thinks a lot about and has protested against ABA for this reason. The other thing that is very much a concern in the autistic community is what ABA practitioners are actually doing in order to get the goals of ABA met. And so ABA procedures have oftentimes been under fire because of the things that are actually done. I mean, in the olden days of ABA, a lot of really awful things were done, things like slapping, screaming, hitting, and skin shocks, etc. We don't do behaviorists don't do as much of that these days, though there are definitely some still aversives in use in certain places. But in ABA, modern day ABA, there are still things like planned ignoring, withholding praise and reward, keeping kids hungry so they like food rewards, etc., and lots of external rewards, candy, stickers, food tokens, only access to circumscribed interests if you get the thing done, etc., as well as really highly emphasizing compliance and things like that. So obviously these are controversial techniques, and people don't always love that this is the way that ABA is done, especially in the modern day. The other thing, of course, is that I've already alluded to, is the outcomes of the ABA techniques are always under scrutiny. The research that's been done to date has not been of the highest quality, and especially when limiting to only the randomized controlled trials and the highest quality evidence, it's a lot weaker than we usually hold other evidence-based interventions to. When you look at things like standard psychotherapy trials, ABA-based interventions do not nearly have as strong of an evidence base as, say, like CBT for depression or anxiety. They have not really been studied in mostly other than like single subject type designs and quasi-experimental designs, as the field of behaviorism really relies on that kind of evidence for most of their work. And there also has been very little outside of like short-term trials for many of these studies. We also, as a field, have really focused on only looking at the benefits, and there has been really very little in terms of adverse event reporting. And so we haven't got a good benefit-harm ratio of what ABA-based interventions do in this community. And there are also other, larger problems with the ABA industry, things like that, private equity has a pretty big stake in this. And so sometimes we're worried about whether or not the providers of ABA in the community are actually, working for the patients or just their own profit, whether or not RBTs, who are the main providers of interventions, are adequately trained, whether there's regional variation in services, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't really have enough to talk about right there, but plenty of things to go over in questions if people are really interested in that. Next slide, please. So Rachel.
All right, thanks for that intro, Zach. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting us. So now that we have some context as to what behavioral intervention or ABA is and some of the concerns with it, I want to then switch over to start talking about NDBIs. NDBI stands for Naturalistic Developmental Behavioral Intervention. So NDBIs were developed sort of as an alternative to the more traditional ABA, like discrete trial training that Zach mentioned. And I have been in the past a clinician at 2 university autism centers that deliver pivotal response treatment, PRT, which is an NDBI with autistic clients. And so there's a few things that all NDBIs, PRT is one NDBI, but there's other ones such as Early Start Denver Model, Project Impact, Jasper, incidental teaching, enhanced milieu teaching. Those are sort of the main ones that you'll hear of, but they all have a few things in common. And these things that all NDBIs have in common, we sort of identified as being a really good foundation for thinking about how we can make sure that ABA is in line with the ideals of the neurodiversity movement. That being that we are making sure that we're accepting everybody for who they are, and that everybody should have the chance to develop their own individual identity, and not everybody has to conform to a neurotypical standard. So we identify in our paper 3 aspects of NDBIs that really set the stage for being aligned with the principles of neurodiversity. One is the idea of co-construction and agency in the intervention experience. So NDBIs really focus on child choice and following the child's lead in the intervention. It's not clinician driven, like some more traditional ABA, where you might see a child and a clinician sitting at a table, and the clinician pulls out stuff and has the child do some pre-programmed activity. It's really led by whatever the child wants to do and what they're interested in. NDBIs hold family partnerships really highly, wanting to make sure that we're working with the family to find out what works best for them. And NDBIs are also focused on motivation and thinking about what are the child's preferences, what are they motivated by, and how can we incorporate that into learning opportunities. The next thing that we identified as being potentially in line with neurodiversity is the use of a strengths-based approach. So all NDBIs really focus on what the kids are good at. And instead of just focusing on what kids maybe aren't as good at, or that what they need to learn, NDBIs take what they're good at and show the kids that they're good at that, showing, and by doing that, it helps boost confidence, boosts motivation. NDBIs always focus on developmentally appropriate goals. So it's looking at that individual child and saying, these are all the great things that this kid is already doing. What's the next developmental step? Not necessarily what's quote unquote age appropriate or what would a neurotypical child be doing, but what's the next best thing for this individual child? And NDBIs do not really explicitly focus on extinguishing or reducing behaviors. And then the last thing that we identified is NDBI's emphasis on naturalistic skill building. So NDBIs are always implemented in the natural environment. So that could be a child's everyday routine, having lunch, going to the park. It could be going to school. The other aspect of the naturalistic skill building is use of naturalistic reinforcement. So in this behavioral sort of contingency, the child does something and then there's a reinforcer. In NDBIs, that reinforcer is always the natural consequence of whatever that behavior was. There's no sort of external things like, oh, you answered a question right, here's a sticker or here's a token. It's there. The learning opportunities should always have some sort of natural consequence. And ideally, NDBI should really look and feel like play and should be fun for the kids and should be fun for the adults. And there are learning opportunities embedded within that, but it should not necessarily feel like work. So we these things are all inherent in all NDBIs, and we felt like these could be a really great foundation for thinking about how behavioral intervention could be made to be in line with neurodiversity perspectives. Next slide, please. That said, there's still a lot of issues with NDBIs. A lot of the concerns that Zack mentioned sort of more broadly about behavioral intervention can still most certainly apply to NDBIs. So even though they provide, this great foundation that I talked about, we still wanted to identify some specific places where there could be improvements made. So the main one that we talk about in the paper is really centering autistic voices. And so in the paper, we have a lot of different suggestions as to what this can actually look like. But one of the main ones that goes along with something that Zack said is making sure that goals are promoting quality of life and not conflicting with an autistic identity or an autistic way of being. It's really, really important that the goals are always sort of serving the client, and that we're thinking of that we're thinking of the client as an autistic client, not that we're trying to get this autistic client to seem more neurotypical. Ways that might be enacted is to seek out autistic consultants or autistic interventionists to evaluate intervention goals, intensity, implementation. If that's not possible, supervisors can encourage their employees to seek out information and provide that information to them. There's a lot of information on the internet, of course, which I'm sure we're all aware of. But if supervisors can sift through that and help their employees find different perspectives that they haven't been exposed to, that could be something that could be beneficial. And then also providing psychoed to clinicians, families, peers about neurodiversity. So right now, if parents aren't told about neurodiversity, or if clients aren't told about neurodiversity, it's kind of up to them to figure it out and find out information about it. And so if NDBI practitioners and other practitioners take it upon themselves to inform families about neurodiversity from the get-go, it can be beneficial moving forward when the intervention is being developed and implemented. Another suggestion we put forth is making sure to continually assess social validity and ecological validity. So social validity referring to the intervention's acceptability, the acceptability of the goals, procedures, and outcomes from all sort of the perspective of all interested parties, and really especially the intervention recipient. A lot of social validity focuses on parents or clinicians and asks them, hey, what did you think about this intervention? But we really need to hear from the intervention recipient themselves. And that might mean using things like preference assessments or other observational assessments, maybe using, potentially using affect as a proxy for acceptability if some clients are not able to communicate their feelings and needs in a way that's compatible with the clinician. And in terms of ecological validity, we really need to do research in community organizations and see how NDBIs are being implemented in the community. And are people trying to take up this idea of neurodiversity aligned NDBIs? And if so, is that working? What do the clients think? How is that being done? And then finally, in terms of research, we present a few different aspects of research that can be improved. So one is doing more community-based partnerships. So partnering with both organizations in the community and also members of the autistic community, using adaptive intervention designs, meaning that if you start an NDBI with a child and you see that they're not, maybe they're not progressing, or they seem to, it's not socially valid for them, you can switch to another intervention or another, do something slightly different. And if you embed that in the research design, it's okay to sort of switch around your research design like that. And then finally, adverse event monitoring is really important in future research. We need to know if there are any side effects or adverse events of behavioral intervention, but also specifically NDBIs. They're seen as very child-friendly and family-focused. And so in theory, they should, like I mentioned, they should be fun, but we need to know, is that actually true? Are kids actually having fun? And long-term, are they seeing the benefit of these NDBIs? So those are just a few of the suggestions that we have. And I think there are probably many more suggestions that we didn't include in the paper, but these are some of the ones that we thought most important to highlight. So I think that's the end of our intro on the paper.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel and Zach, for that intro. And I'm going to try and pick up that thread and hand the ball back to you both. And so there's a theme of partnership here in several of those big points you highlighted just now of, obviously listening to the person who you're serving in a clinical service context, but also the communities that you're serving too. And I think that's evident in even the construction of the paper itself. You make a point of highlighting your positionality as an author group. And I'd like you both to maybe talk about how that came together and maybe how others, can form those kinds of professional collaborations.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the way it came together is we originally started working on this in the Kegel Autism Center at UC Santa Barbara, which is where I was a grad student. And we had some ideas about things that we could say about NDBIs potentially being theoretically aligned with the idea of neurodiversity. And so we had written like some random paragraphs, but we knew that we wanted to, check in with autistic members of the autistic community, and also members of the autistic community who do have differing perspectives themselves, because we knew obviously not everybody in the autistic community thinks exactly the same thing. So we ended up reaching out to an autistic BCBA to see if she was interested. And then I think the director of the center, Dr. Ty Vernon, had known Zack. And so he invited Zack to be a part of the paper. And honestly, with the collaboration between so many different people and with different backgrounds from different fields, the paper ended up being something much different than I think we thought it would be at the beginning, and it evolved so much. And I don't think it would be anywhere near what it is now if it wasn't for that collaboration. I don't know if you want to add anything, Zack.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was definitely a great answer. And it really, we ended up having a very good and long discussion. I mean, there was definitely a draft written when I started on it, but we had a lot of back and forth about many different ideas, and we kind of brought in a whole lot of literature on a ton of different things. In fact, I think that paper ended up citing a whole bunch of blog posts, Facebook groups, and sort of community type resources that were kind of brought in from the autistic people in the group, because it ended up being kind of a merger of kind of the academic and non-academic aspects of the entire BCBA autism behavior analysis idea sphere. And not only was it, how can we make behavior analysis more neurodiversity friendly, but it was also a summary of how can we summarize the controversy itself. What is the issue that we're trying to talk about here, because for a long time I think this has just been a problem that has been raging online that not talked about in the academic sphere. So that was another kind of sub theme of the paper that we wanted to just put into academics' ears, that a lot of people I think were aware of but had not had a citable reference for.
Yeah, you can't do an academic lit search and get all of those voices. And so for one, by citing them, you're kind of bringing it into that discourse, but it underscores both of your points already, that academics and clinicians can't stay within their bubble when they're practicing, when they're developing new interventions, when they're thinking about research. And so, you've made the point in a few different ways that, obviously there are different groups of, voices that have to be a part of that. And so what does it look like in practice to, reach out to the autistic community or to parent groups, to clinicians, and reconcile those things? I'm thinking of, the clinician on the street corner who is trying to do good in the world, or the grad student in the audience who's trying to develop a project.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's difficult. First of all, sometimes you don't really know where to start, and sometimes when you are involved with the community, there are a lot of different and frankly conflicting perspectives. If you are just out there trying to do good, you know, sometimes one of the things to just start with is, who in your community is the community voice, because I think starting locally is really important. If there are people doing advocacy in your specific sphere, talking to them, and if they have their own resources, their own involvement, their own people to talk to, those are usually the best people in your area. I think that's really powerful and can do a lot of good, especially if those people are hooked into some of the same organizations that your organization could be hooked into, like school systems, et cetera. But I think then, also going more broadly, if you are doing, like, let's say research, there are, things like, and I will put a little disclaimer, this is like a resource that I helped create, but like, things like the INSAR community collaborator request that, if you wanted to do a participatory research project, and you want, say, an autistic collaborator to help you consult on a research project, you can always say, like, hi, I'm a researcher who wants to, study, an NDBI, and I need an autistic consultant to make sure that my protocol is acceptable. You can always put out a request for a collaborator on that platform. So even if you don't know who exactly would be your consultant, there are places to do that. And I think a lot of people, even before something like the ICCR was around, there are enough people doing this kind of work now that you can find people in expanded networks to be able to do this. It's harder, especially if you're not as linked in, but I do think that more and more autistic people are wanting to be a part of this, and ask us. I mean, truly, especially if you have funds to pay people, like there are definitely is interest in the community and in helping out with projects like this, especially the more impactful the project can be. And if you can compensate people, they often do actually want to help out.
Yeah, just to add to that, the other autistic co-author, Patrick Dwyer, I just found his blog and I just randomly reached out to him one day to see if he was interested in this, but also another study. And so that ended up being totally random, but a really great partnership. So I highly suggest doing that. In terms of reaching the clinicians who, like you said, who are just sort of down the corner, who maybe are not plugged into what's going on in academia, or aren't scouring the internet to look at different controversies, that is such a huge issue, and something that I don't know how to handle that, because there are certainly, I hear a lot of stories from families of people who practitioners, clinicians who are doing things that are totally not in line with neurodiversity, and also not even really in line with fidelity of NDBIs or behavioral intervention. And so it's how can we get to those community members? And that is super tricky. I think one thing, this is not the answer to this problem, but one thing that I think can be helpful is if we are able to provide education about what neurodiversity is to a more general audience. It can be clinicians, but I'm thinking more to school children, to parents, making sure that parents, when their kids getting diagnosed, that they're getting information about neurodiversity. If neurodiversity is more understood by a larger group of people, it's going to become less and less acceptable for clinicians in the community to be doing things that are wildly out of line with these ideas. So
there are many questions brewing in the background, and we're going to get to them. But one thing I want to ask before we turn it over to Elisabeth is, you made a point in the slides and in the paper that NDBIs, almost by definition, aren't focused on behavior reduction. We're not trying to get rid of behaviors. We're trying to skill build, help people sort of grow in the ways that they want to grow. Is behavior reduction like reducing aggression or reducing self-injury or reducing elopement sort of inherently in conflict with the neurodiversity framework from your perspective? And people will have vastly different, perspectives on that. But I'm curious, from both, having thought about these issues a lot, what are our options there, and how do you think about it?
So one thing is that I don't think it necessarily has to be in conflict with the neurodiversity perspective. I think that it comes back to this idea of, are we trying to intervene upon things that are seen as sort of like core aspects of a person's identity or personality or way of being? Or is it something else that is going to maybe keep them safe or healthy and things like that? So I do think that plays a huge role. I think the other thing is thinking about when there are these kinds of things that maybe we need to work on with kids that they aren't going to work on, or that might be hard, or behavior reduction, like reducing aggression. We also need to move beyond that behavior and think about what antecedent is happening to make the person feel that they need to engage in that behavior. And when thinking about it that way, it's not so much of behavior reduction, but also what can we do to improve the environment so that behavior is not something that person wants to engage in as much.
Right. Yeah. To piggyback off that, I think that almost never is the issue of behavior reduction with a truly aggressive or harmful behavior the issue of are we harming this person's identity. I mean, when it is a safety concern, that is not usually something that neurodiversity advocates are worried about. I think that when it is a non-harmful behavior, that is something that people are then a little bit more up in arms about. I mean, it's like, are we forcing eye contact? Are we stopping some kid from doing some self-stimulatory behavior, things like that? I mean, then I think that's where more of the controversy comes about. But I mean, we actually, Rachel and I did a study where we were looking at different behavior goals for interventions, and one of the things that most autistic adults felt was a really almost completely uncontroversial goal was something like reducing aggression or reducing self-injury. Things like that are very, very cut and dry goals for interventions across the board, because people realize those are health risks, those are bad, those are things that people think are good to stop when they happen. And in general, I think, even though NDBIs themselves are not necessarily set up for that, I mean, there are plenty of behavioral interventions that are, mostly function-based treatments, things like that. You essentially look for what, is causing the behavior, and, you stop what is reinforcing it, et cetera. And then that is the goal. And so, I mean, oftentimes if you are, fixing the underlying issue, then that is the problem. And so, if you are trying to change something about the autistic person's identity that is causing them to be aggressive because you keep taking away their toys because they don't like their ABA, then maybe that's the issue. But I mean, there is, potentially some other context that's needed.
All right. I could do this all day, but we have a limited time. And so I'm going to invite Elisabeth Sheridan to bring forth some questions from the larger audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cy, and thank you, Zach and Rachel, for that wonderful summary and discussion of the paper. I can say there have been so many good questions. We have about 17 minutes. So my thought is, if it's okay with you, Zach and Rachel, some have been directly to Rachel or Zach, and some are for both. So I'll try to kind of funnel to each so we can get through all of them, if that's okay. Zach, if you want to kick us off, this is a big one. It's been addressed to some extent already, but if you could give us your thoughts on research demonstrating increased PTSD rates for autistic people who have gone through ABA. I know we can probably, like I said, many of these questions we could unpack for probably 15 minutes at a time, but your thoughts on the ABA PTSD perspective would be really helpful to start us off.
Sure. Yeah. So yes, there's one like specific study on that. And I mean, to be like short about it is like not the greatest study of all time. The measure that they used to measure PTSD symptoms was not like a, validated measure of PTSD symptoms. This was like an online study. It was not like, that they used like a CAPS or anything. And so, I mean, it's weak evidence at best. It's not to say that like there couldn't potentially be a link, but I think that the evidence is like particularly weak. I do think that we should do more to look at harms of ABA, but I think that particular harm that ABA is like so traumatizing to be of the like PTSD causing kind is like not something that I am like the most concerned about. I have never actually, in all of the autistic adults I have ever seen a person whose PTSD was like truly from ABA. And I have evaluated quite a lot of autistic adults in my career. And so I do actually think that it would be interesting to look at more like subtle harms of ABA. I think that is probably where the real harm comes out. I am much less convinced that there is like true PTSD from ABA in most cases. I think you could probably get PTSD from some of the aversives that are used, like contingent electric skin shock. That could definitely cause PTSD in some cases. But I think in most ways the ABA is practiced today, that's very unlikely to cause PTSD as we currently define it.
Thanks for that, Zach. Rachel, anything there? Because the next one is for you, but I want to give you a chance if you have anything to add there.
I think I agree with everything Zach said. I think the key will just be to monitor these things for both clinicians, not totally non-academic clinicians, and for researchers to try their best to come up with measures of adverse events and all these other sorts of things, so we can actually have a better idea of what's happening and doing these kinds of things long term. Even like following up with people 10 years later to see if they remember things that they did in ABA. That might be difficult, but I think that kind of thing is really needed so that we can actually figure out what's going on. But at the same time, listening to people who say that they have had those experiences and being aware that if some people are saying that that's the outcome that they've had, that acknowledging that is true for some people. And so making sure then that we do everything we can to make sure that doesn't get perpetuated.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Rachel, next up is, how do you conceptualize the line between improving quality of life versus teaching masking? Some examples would be great too.
So I think that's really tricky. And I think it's something that as a neurotypical person, I can't necessarily just say like my opinion on it, because I think that it's going to differ slightly from person to person. And also, I think autistic people may conceptualize quality of life differently than a neurotypical person. For example, like a stereotypical neurotypical person might really enjoy going out in like loud crowds with a bunch of people and having a dinner with like 10 different people and having crosstalk amongst everybody and the whole table. But that might not be something that an autistic person wants. They may prefer to have one-on-one conversations, or they may prefer to interact with, they might prefer or feel more comfortable interacting with autistic people. And as a neurotypical person, we can't necessarily assume that like the best thing to do would be to throw a bunch of neurotypical peers around an autistic child. So I think we have to listen to autistic people, and whether that means having an autistic consultant or looking at research that's done with autistic adults on what quality of life means for them, and being really sensitive to the fact that like my quality of life is not the same as someone else's quality of life, and that may be even more different for a neurotypical versus autistic person. And in terms of not teaching masking, we need to think about whatever the goal we have is, like what really is the purpose of the goal. And if we can't just say quality of life, we have to give it a reason for why this is going to help quality of life. One other particular example that comes to mind that I know is can be controversial, and some of the participants in the study, the other study that Zack and I did together, they brought up a lot, is focusing on spoken language, like exclusively focusing on spoken language. So neurotypical people may think that, oh, well, having a good quality of life, like the majority of neurotypical people use spoken language. So therefore, if we didn't have spoken language, maybe we wouldn't have as good of a quality of life. So therefore, we need to get all autistic kids to use spoken language. And that's something that the autistic community seems to not feel is necessary for quality of life. There's a lot of other communication alternatives like devices or signing that may be preferable or more accessible. And so pushing for spoken language at the expense of all of these other alternatives is not necessarily going to be improving quality of life, even if a neurotypical person thinks it is from their perspective.
Fantastic. And a great kind of piggyback question came in based on the comments you just made, Rachel. So I'm going to ask you, Zack, to take this one and just add anything else regarding the quality of life masking piece, if you'd like. Someone says, I'm wondering about Rachel's comment about judging social validity from the child's behavior affect, because some kids appear to really like more traditional ABA and things like sticker systems, for example, which we try to steer away from. How do we balance this?
No, that's a great question. And it is really hard. I think when all you have to go off of is the child's preferences, and you can't get an internal like determination of their self-report. Like if they cannot, self-report because of their age or their cognitive function, I mean, that's the best interpretation that you have, then you should probably do what they enjoy. I mean, it would be good to offer non-traditional methods like NDBIs and see if they do seem to like that better. But if they truly like traditional ABA better and you can use that to teach the skills, then arguably do what they prefer. That seems to be appropriate. If it is equally effective and does not seem to be harmful based on the available evidence, then do what they like. If they do not seem to be having a negative affect from it, I mean, again, you can, it's all within the realm of clinical judgment. But if the kid's liking it, I mean, again, it's the same way if a child just wants to sit in the corner and stack blocks for like 6 hours, then you're like, well, I wouldn't let my neurotypical child do that because they would be like tediously bored. But theoretically, the autistic child like doesn't hate this. So this is probably okay, at least for their leisure time. So yeah, it's probably fine.
Thanks, Zack. And quickly, Rachel, I'm going to pivot back to you and piggyback 2 questions because I think one's pretty quick to answer and the other is not. So a good question, can this be used, so NDBIs, be used for newly diagnosed autistic adults or mainly just for children? So that's part 1. Actually, just go ahead and, yeah, because the second part's really long, so.
Okay. That's a good question. I don't know of research that's been done on NDBIs with adults. I think in theory, the principles of like embedding natural reinforcement into everyday life like should be applicable to adults. But that would look different than doing it with a young child. So I would say in theory, yes, but I can't say for sure what that would look like exactly.
Yeah, so to jump in there, I know there was actually, back when I was at Yale, we did do some form of PRT with adults. I forget exactly what the lessons, I mean, it was obviously very different from what PRT looked like with kids. And it was, yeah, I mean, it kind of looked like, psychotherapy almost. But I mean, theoretically, it was used with PRT principles. I don't know. Pam Ventola was the PI. Could probably talk to her about what that was actually looking like. And I don't know if Bob or Lynn was consulting on the project or something, but we could, figure out how that actually worked. And yeah, theoretically, there probably are ways of, kind of using these principles to do, different kinds of therapies. But yes, it is very much an early childhood intervention most of the time, though, does not have to be.
Perfect. Thank you both. Rachel, if you want to tackle this one first, and then Zach hop in for sure, that it's longer. Are there any research articles that ask youth who are currently receiving ABA how it's going for them? We found articles about harm, but when we present it to our ABA colleagues, they say it's older people, that's not what's done now, that sort of thing. How can we help BCBAs move towards more of this type of NDBI work?
Sorry, can you just remind me of the first sentence of that question? Sorry.
Yeah, it's basically getting, and we've touched on this a little so far, but what do we know from an evidence perspective about, do we actually have some articles talking about youth's experience or folks in general, their experience receiving ABA, how is it actually going for them? It sounds like this person with their ABA colleagues have presented some of the older research maybe on harm and other, so what do we actually know, right? Is I think what they're trying to get at.
So I've definitely seen a few interview studies with adults talking about their experience when they were children. And so that could be used to try to present it to supervisors. I know that even though qualitative research is very valid, I know that some people can write it off if they say, oh, there were only 5 people in this study, so we're not going to pay attention to this. So the study that Zach and I did together was where we presented, we had autistic adults give feedback on PRT sessions with autistic kids and clinicians or parents, and asked for their feedback. And so even though the adults were not giving feedback on their own behavioral intervention, and not everybody in the study received behavioral intervention as a child, they were at least commenting on both positives and negatives of PRT, which is seen as, quote unquote new ABA. And so there were definitely things that they saw that were good about it, but plenty of things that they also critiqued. And so that would be something that could be brought to your supervisor, saying I know that there's lots of problems with ABA in the past, but look, there's still some things that we can address.
And I think that one other thing to jump in is that in general, I would say that the literature is pretty scant. We don't, like I was kind of saying earlier, there is not a lot of literature focused on this, and especially from the first person perspective. When people if you were to do a literature search that said ABA social validity, you get a ton of studies that are this is how much the parents liked the study, or this is how much the kid or the clinicians liked the intervention, and very few of we actually did some sort of assessment to think about how much the kids getting the intervention were doing, or we did some sort of self-report of, and oftentimes these are toddler age kids, so it's qualitatively harder to get their reports. So I can understand that from a feasibility standpoint, but there are ways to do this, and it's just because it's harder doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done.
Absolutely. Thank you for that important point. I am so disappointed because there are about 4 other really good questions, but what I've done is I've noted who they came from. So I'm going to try to get our panelists when we wrap here in just a few minutes to maybe email you folks directly if we didn't get to your question. When Sai and I were brainstorming kind of what this panel would look like. We had a feeling we could probably go for 2 hours. We also acknowledged it's the middle of the summer and I'm on vacation. I know many folks in this call are on vacation and are that excited to talk about this that they wanted to come anyways, which is why we've recorded it. So I think in the interest of just staying and keeping us on time, I want to wrap up and just thank our panelists so much. So Rachel and Zach, as co-authors of the paper, you shared with us your wonderful expertise. Cy, as our moderator, Cy and myself and Lindsay Burrell, who's in the room as a past co-chair of our SIG, we were at dinner at ABCT in November, and I think we talked about this paper for about an hour over dinner, like nerds do at conferences, and that's partly why we were so excited to have this type of conversation. I think we had about 85 people at the peak, over 180 registered, so I think that speaks to the need for us to continue these conversations. Our membership committee and leadership will get together and think about our next event. I'm sharing this slide just to direct folks. If you missed the beginning, please do check out our website and join our SIG if you aren't officially a member, because we'll be sharing many more events like this and our pre-conference. We're also going to ask you all for feedback, so there will be some sort of email follow-up asking you. We got some great feedback even via Twitter around things to consider and think about for our next discussion series, so we will take that seriously. And Cy, anything else to close us out, because we've got about a minute before folks get their summer Fridays back.
I'll just add my appreciation to Zach and Rachel. Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
And Grace Lee, if you could just leave the meeting open, I want to grab a few things out of the chat still to make sure that we address everybody coming in.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Thank you everyone for joining. That was a great discussion, Zach and Rachel, and thank you, Cy and Elisabeth, for your help and hard work with all the questions and moderating.
Of course.